Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
Every morning, William went to work with great pleasure. After all, he was doing what he had dreamed of since childhood. He read a lot of medical literature, and even before entering the institute, he was already immersed in this science. As long as I can remember, he always believed that he would treat and save people. Therefore, as soon as he was awarded a diploma of graduation from medical school, he literally the next day worked in one of the hospitals of the city. The young promising surgeon was gladly accepted, and never regretted after that. From the first day, he showed himself as a qualified specialist. And after a year, it was not so easy to get to him for surgery. Everyone literally begged to book William. He, in turn, was ready to work literally day and night for himself and asked to substitute colleagues. Everyone knew that William is a hardened bachelor, so gladly agreed to spend his free time at his favorite work. Almost everyone in the team respected the smart, kind, and helpful surgeon. He was always happy to help prompt in any matter. What about the patients? He cared for each of them with heart and soul. If there was a particularly complex operation, he could not leave the hospital. All the next day until he was sure the ward was OK. By the age of 35, William was already a well-known doctor in the city, saved more than a dozen lives. Among his former patients were drivers and principals, milkmaids and teachers. Ranks, status, and titles did not matter to him. He fought for every life in exactly the same way and did everything possible, and sometimes impossible, to help patients. If in his career William achieved what he wanted, his personal life remained unchanged. He was considered an enviable groom. Many girls looked back at the regular brunette. Men really was a handsome man under 2 meters tall, with a very pleasant velvet voice of one of the patients. I once even said to William, "Yes, you can treat patients without a scalpel or drugs. As soon as I hear your voice, all my ailments go away." To this, the doctor smiled and jokingly replied, "Adriana, if your hernia from this would dissolve without surgery, I would agree even to sing in your bed. Well, for now, let's change your blood pressure, look at your labs, and get ready for the operating room." In addition to his well-known gift for surgery, he also had a gift for easy communication. William had a way of convincing, calming, and setting patients at ease. So they agreed to any operation with complete calmness. All as one were sure of a speedy recovery and trusted the doctor completely. Knowing that William was ready to spend all his free time in the walls of his favorite institution, colleagues often took advantage of this. Everyone knew that at any time it was possible to ask him at least during the day or at night, and he would gladly replace them on duty. Kathy and Betty, who worked as a nurse. Older pensioners often joked about Kathy's grandmother, as she was called in the ward, whispered to her friend what he had to do at home alone. She had a family, children within 4 walls. Yeah, well, Betty supported her. At least there was some companionship. Sighing, she continued, "Don't worry, I didn't. You never have." But no one could know what was in the surgeon's past. He never shared it with anyone and remained a mystery to all the unmarried beauties in the hospital. When once again deciding to take advantage of his kindness, Evelyn, one of the doctors on the ward, approached him in the middle of the day. He smiled and was the first to strike up a conversation. Let me guess, probably need to fill in on night duty. He knew that Evelyn's husband worked as a truck driver. She'd asked him to fill in a couple times when he was passing through unexpectedly. Knowing William wouldn't say no. "Thank you, you're my savior, my best colleague and friend in the world. When you get married, I'm ready to take all your shifts for the duration of your and your sweetheart's honeymoon." Betty happily created and smacked William on the cheek. Then she disappeared. They had a very warm, friendly relationship ever since they came to the hospital at the same time after institute. William had never refused to help her, to give her a hint or a substitute if necessary. This time, of course, he agreed. All the more the duty promised to be quiet. The resuscitation room was empty. Heavy patients or planned operations were not expected. All examinations and appointments were carried out so that it was possible to plunge into studying new articles on surgery at night. In the evening, William went through all the wards, made sure everything was in order, and went to the resident's room. He spent so much time in the hospital that he even subscribed to magazines at that address, and once a month received the Medical Gazette, which he studied from cover to cover. In any free time, be it on duty or lunch break, he immersed himself in the study of news and advances in the field of medicine and dreamed of defending his dissertation soon. Having finished reading the next article, William put the kettle on and decided to cheer up a bit with a cup of coffee. When the phone rang and picking up the receiver, he heard William, "This is Camille, the duty nurse of the gynecology department. We have a 27-year-old slender woman in labor. It's a surgical emergency. A cesarean is necessary, and your counseling is also needed." The hospital often brought in a surgeon from other departments when surgery was needed. So William was not surprised and immediately replied, "I'll be right there. Prepare the patient's operating room." Sadly, after watching Nevsky's Singing Kettle, he turned off the appliance and headed for the exit. Going up to the floor above where gynecology was, he met Robert, the duty doctor of this department, almost at the door. He briefly told him about the patient. The woman in labor was a young, perfectly healthy woman. And the only difficulty was that 3 babies were to be born at once. I decided not to risk one. I could do it myself. But in this case, what about surgery? I'm sorry for throwing you a job, Robert said with a smile. But William, as always, found the answer easily. "Robert, what do you know? I love the job, and every shift I'm on, there's a surgery. So let's get going, or the mom's gonna have 3 without our help." After a quick change of clothes, they entered the delivery room. As soon as William saw the face of the woman in labor, he could hardly restrain himself not to scream or, worse, to faint in happiness. It was at this point that his help was not needed. Otherwise, he would definitely not have been able to take the instrument in his hands. While the physiologist was working on the patient, William's thoughts drifted to the distant past. When he was a student, he had been madly in love with a woman of his own. The wrong one William met when he was in his final year at the institute. The girl came to see the girlfriend of William's classmate, and he, only seeing the fragile silhouette in the sunlight on the porch of the institute, literally lost the power of speech. Betty. It seemed to him then that she was light, airy, and not only outwardly, but also in communication. She was short with a long braid and sky-blue eyes. Betty seemed to live from the first seconds at William's place. He started looking for every possible and impossible way to see her. Even his parents noticed that their son had changed a lot. Mom, one day, unable to stand it, when the son came back late at night, happily humming some Skulliger under his nose, quietly asked Sonny, "And you happen to be in love, because maybe we need to get ready for the wedding. And we have no idea. Have you even met your beauty?" William hugged his mother affectionately, kissed her, and suddenly pulled her away and said, "Why not? I'll bring her over tomorrow and introduce her. So pies and wait." Betty, having learned about the forthcoming acquaintance, was in a panic. Being a modest, shy girl, she timidly spoke up. "William, maybe we shouldn't. I'm afraid. Maybe they don't like me. We don't know each other very well yet, and your parents are the most famous people in town. Who am I?" The William family was very famous indeed. Father, former head doctor of one of the hospitals, now retired, counseling, formerly in a private clinic. William's mother worked for many years as head of a central pharmacy, and below was from the village. Her parents lived very modestly. Father and mother worked on the farm for pennies, but it is true, saved the household. On doubting the favorite guy, only smiling, answered Betty. "But how can you not like you? Don't make it up." He put his arm around her and whispered, "You'll see. They like me, will love you the first time they see you, and will definitely get married." At that moment, he couldn't even imagine what would really happen. His mother and father were greeted with joy the next day, but the joy turned out to be false after half an hour of communication. Having learned everything, so to speak, necessary to the girl her family, the mother asked William to help her in the kitchen to organize tea. Only he came, and the mother, with some anger, began to whisper to her son, "Are we that rustic to her? Were you raised? Raised. Just think what your future holds. You could become a famous surgeon. And would such a shepherdess be a worthy wife for such a man? You see, she'll only drag you down, not give you a chance to do science. In the first few years, she'll bear you a bunch of children, and thoughts of medicine will become thoughts of where to earn money to support the family. Know this. My father and I are totally against having a daughter-in-law like that. What are you talking about? She's a wonderful girl. I love her. You and Daddy will like her too. Let's go and have some tea. Let's hurry up with your goodies, cake and cups. William replied and picked up everything she had put on the table. Mother carried it into the room, making it clear that the conversation was over. But it wasn't. From that day on, Mother began to pretend every time they met that they didn't exist. Or she kept talking her son into parting with the carcass. As they say, water treads water. After a while, William himself began to doubt whether they were right for each other. Quarrels and misunderstandings became more and more frequent between him and Betty. After the next conflict, the girl cried and said, "You know, after the visit to your parents between us, as if a cat ran between us. You are constantly dissatisfied with something, as if trying to find only bad things in me. I can't take it anymore. William, let's not see each other for a while. Will you decide in the meantime? Do you want what your mom says a shepherdess is like?" Pausing, she added, "Your mom even found out where I work so she could come to my store and tell me what your future holds and how I'm going to get in your way. She said the place is as redneck as it gets behind the counter. They're right there with you in life. So I'm sorry, I can't do this anymore." William tried to stop her, but apparently didn't do it very convincingly, so she left. They never saw each other again. He tried to track Betty down the next day through a friend at work, but the answer was the same everywhere. She packed her things and told him not to look. William kept looking for a while, but Betty just disappeared. He even began to admit the idea that she had gone to her homeland or to another city. But he didn't know anything about it. Studying, Diploma Defense spun so that there was little time even to sleep. William wanted to drive to the village where Betty's parents stayed, but he never found the time. William graduated from college and got a job in a hospital, but thoughts of his beloved never left him. He tried to forget about the past and even marry one of his patients. From the first day of his stay at the hospital, Jenna paid special attention to the young surgeon. William was working in the department for the first year, and the persistent beauty got her way. After her recovery and discharge, they started dating. And 6 months later, she also smoothly brought things up to the point that William himself didn't understand why he had proposed to her. It wasn't to say that he had absolutely no feelings at all. To Jenna, there was infatuation, which with time passed, but the soul was silent. Or rather, it simply, like his heart, continued to love only Betty. The wedding with Jenna decided not to make noisy and pompous. It was her second marriage. So she immediately said, "Honey, I don't need a veil and a white dress. Let's just go to a restaurant and go somewhere else for a vacation." He, as well as always in their relationship, agreed to all domestic issues and their solution. Jenna as if immediately took into her own hands and could solve them, sometimes without even consulting William. Mother and father from the first meeting gladly met a bright and active girl's son, and from the first minutes gave their consent to marriage. Although at that moment it was not even talked about it. Mom went the tried and tested way. And when he brought Jenna to get acquainted, the mother called her son, again to help allegedly with tea. Betty, in contrast to their previous interactions, joyfully whispered, "Son, this is your destiny. God has sent you such happiness as if by order. Smart, spectacular, promising. Get married right away. She's your destiny." Jenna was indeed a promising financier, deputy director of a bank. Spectacular blonde with luxurious windows, with a slender figure and refined facial features, made many men turn around. This time the word of his mother again had not the last place, and she still convinced William to get married. Registration of the marriage was held without a fuss, after which there was a dinner in a small but very cozy restaurant. The celebration was held in a narrow circle. Jenna's parents were working somewhere abroad and said that they would congratulate the young people on their arrival. At the gala evening were William's parents smiling happily, looking at their son and a few friends from the bride and groom's side. After the wedding, they almost immediately went to the sea at Jenna's insistence. But already there William did not like the way she flirts with men every chance she gets. And William only joked about it. I just want to promote jealousy and passion in you. Do I need anyone but you? It doesn't matter who I smile at. It's who I rush to bed with at night. And that's you, my good man. At times like this, William realized that if anyone had dared to pay Betty any attention at all, he would have killed them. And with Jenna, he was rather unpleasant. Unpleasant that in front of him, she could easily allow herself to forget he existed and start chatting with another strange man, smiling at him, dancing with him. And it was as if her husband remained aloof. But William did not even feel jealousy as well as love. Passion initially was, but with time passed for a year and a half, family life went on as usual. In the morning breakfast, wishing a good day, work, dinner at home, or sometimes in a restaurant. But as time went on, Jenna stayed longer and longer at work and returned more often after 0 o'clock. William began to suspect that his wife had a lover, but strangely enough, nothing in his soul moved. And this time he simply began to think more often about his first love, Justify. Often analyzing family life with Jenna, he saw that the one from a faithful, devoted, seemingly wife turns into a public persona, giving her interviews, local newspapers and magazines as the spouse of a hopeful surgeon for all the late comings home was always ready. Response: well, William, you can't have the wife of a doctor like you being ungroomed and unattractive. So I went to the salon for a spa and stopped by the store to pick out something new. By the way, Financial Workers' Day is coming up, and I probably need to go to an appointment or a corporate retreat, so I'm all set. Betty reached up to kiss her husband, but he was sick of the false emotion and talk. With a wave of his hand, William retired to his room. He had been thinking about divorce for a long time and thought of Betty more and more often. He saw her everywhere on the streets, in transportation, even dreamed about her at night. When his wife's insolence went beyond all limits, and she sometimes did not even come home. At night, William decided to file for divorce. Jenna did not want children, so everything went quickly and painlessly. By that time, the former spouse had already found a rich businessman and did not hide her contempt at the divorce, said, I thought you were a star shining, and you're going to be stuck in this city clinic. I'm sorry, I have other plans for my life. Bye. Good luck, Ibolite. William finally saw his ex without masks and deceit and seemed relieved. Now he could say his favorite Betty with a clear conscience. He even knew who would help him do it. Among the lives saved, the surgeon had so many specialists in different fields that it was enough just to pour through the business cards, left with a request to contact, and any problem could be solved. William tried not to take advantage of this, but this time it was impossible to do without the help of a professional. He remembered that recently he had operated on a detective from a private agency who had been brought in with suspected appendicitis and was already in the emergency room. The appendix had ruptured, and if he hadn't been on duty, William doesn't know if he would have survived or not. He's a detective. That operation was very heavy, and the chances of life were clearly not 100%. But an experienced surgeon quickly brought Stephen back to life. That was the detective's name. In the past, Stephen was a police officer in the investigation of crimes and was famous in the department for the fact that he could literally from the ground to get the necessary information. Stephen had been involved in several operations and was always jokingly outraged in the ward. Some inflamed gut drove him to the hospital. But now, in addition to battle scars, there are, so to speak, simple, everyday scars. He was grateful to the doctor. And now it was time to ask for the promised help. The detective was overjoyed at the surgeon's call. William, it's so good to hear from you. Thank you 100 times over for my life. What can I do for you? They agreed to meet at a nearby cafe where William told of his desire to find an ex-lover. You know, I was such a fool back then. It seemed like a great future in surgery, the need for new knowledge. And now I'm supposed to get married. And Betty really wanted kids right away. My kind mom and dad told me that she was a country girl. Well, everything piled up in one pile, and I was in a tizzy. Then she disappeared and I got a new job. It's like a whirlwind. Stephen, having taken all the necessary information, promised to help the savior, asking only already leaving for the village, then did not go. Maybe he lives at his parents' house without suspecting anything. William said quietly, "No, I'm ashamed to admit it. But in the year we'd known each other, I'd never found out where she came from. All I knew was that she came from the countryside, some almost abandoned village. I'd been to the rented apartment where she lived, but the landlady didn't know anything about him. She never showed up at work again. So I've already checked it out. Now we have to keep looking." Stephen shook the surgeon's hand and said he would find his lover. Occasionally, he called William to confirm details and keep him informed. Each time, he would let him know if he had learned anything new. One day, Stephen called and said he had to meet. Everything seemed to freeze in William's soul, and he could not wait for the appointed hour in excitement. He came to the cafe where they agreed long before the appointed time and was already finishing his third cup of green tea. When the detective appeared, he took a seat at the table and asked the waiter to bring coffee. "Where? What about her?" After a pause, William started first. "Please tell me she's all right. I don't care if she's married or not. As long as she's alive and well." It was like he had a premonition. His heart clenched and wouldn't let go. You could see Stephen was having a hard time starting this conversation. He made a few phone calls, coffee. Then, after a moment's silence, he held out an envelope. When William pulled the photo out of it, the first picture was of a memorial with a profile of his beloved Betty and the dates of birth and death. "You didn't get there in time to find her. A stupid car accident took the life of your beloved. She's buried in one of the cemeteries. There's a photo on the back. The address number of the place where she's lying." Stephen said that Betty was on her way to work that day and was standing at a bus stop waiting for transportation. The drunken driver of the minibus had lost control and plowed into the bus stop at full speed. It was early morning, and there were not many people. 2 of them got off with minor injuries. One girl with a concussion went to the hospital, and as Betty was the first to get in the way and died on the spot from her injuries. Only one thought pulsed through the doctor's mind at that moment. Why her? Why his Betty? That day at the cafe, William seemed to have one last chance at happiness at love. Buried now tightly under that stone slab with the profile of his beloved. How long he sat there and how Stephen left, he no longer remembered. The tears seemed endless. On the morning, he bought a huge bouquet of white roses and went to the cemetery. "Well, here we are, my beloved, putting roses in the headboard," William said quietly. "This is not how I imagined our meeting. I'm sorry, my darling. I dreamed of making amends for my youth. But time has decided otherwise. Forgive me if you can. I still love only you." He sat in the cemetery for hours. Only when the caretaker came up and asked if you were all right, if you needed help. It was as if he'd come to his senses and headed for the exit. William was walking immersed in his bitter thoughts when he heard complaints of a squeaky hiss from the side of the garbage cans at the cemetery exit. 2 shot dirty dogs had cornered a small ginger kitten and were trying to paw at it with their claws. Just a little bit more. They would have torn the little one to shreds. But William quickly went to the rescue, grabbing a stick from the ground. He swung it menacingly at the freight train. "Come on, let's get out of here. What are you thinking?" 2 against 1 kid. The dogs immediately scattered, and the ginger lump was frightened by the close set of eyes, as if he didn't know what to do next. William picked up the kitten from the ground and said quietly, "Well, my friend Betty, I guess that's how Betty leaves me a memory of himself. You're just as defenseless as she was. Well, let's go home and I'll feed you and you'll be my friend. That's what I'll call you. By the way, Buddy. William, it's your turn to help." Brought him back from memory to reality by Robert. William, being a true professional, was able to control his emotions and performed the operation perfectly. 2 boys and their fragile little sister were born. Back in the ward that night, William could not even sleep for a minute. In front of his eyes stood the painfully familiar face of the woman in labor. He wanted so much to believe that mistakes like that were possible in life, and there was a chance that his beloved was alive. There could be. He thought at that moment something might have happened that caused a completely different girl to be buried in the cemetery than his Betty. But then why didn't she recognize him? Maybe she didn't want to. After all, he had betrayed her. In the morning, he decided to go back to genealogy, ostensibly to check on the patient and the babies. But he decided to look at the card himself. The young mother's data did not match his favorite surname at all. The name was different, and there was a dash in the relatives column. Betty was an orphan. The man stood with the card in his hands and could not understand how it was possible that two completely alien people could look so similar. At that moment, Robert, my colleague, entered the office. "Don't worry, you're on your feet. Everything's fine, with Mommy and the babies. You and I have done a great job. So we're entitled to coffee. My treat." He winked and continued, "For without you, I wouldn't have gotten this trio in so quickly." They went to the first floor where there was a cafeteria and spent half an hour talking about everything. When William returned to the ward, his thoughts continued to revolve around the maternity ward. All sorts of things crossed his mind. He even decided that Betty really could have been a twin sister. They could have been separated as children, for example, by parents who were unable to raise two people at once. One, for example, had been left in the maternity ward. He even allowed for thoughts of tampering or stealing one of the babies there as well. When he returned home that day, even his faithful buddy didn't recognize his master. William came in brooding, immersed in his thoughts. He didn't pour milk into his friend's bowl as usual, but just patted him and went into the room. He remembered about William's pet only when that cleverest creature, as he thought, began to race through the half-empty dishes for his food. "Oh, I forgot all about it. I'm sorry, sweet friend." "Come, we'll lay my wine before you," said the host and went into the kitchen. "There we pour the milk." He added, "Sorry, I have another head full of milk and goodies." Friend gratefully rubbed at his master's feet, as if happy to see his mood change. William sometimes seemed to understand him. And when he returned from work, he often talked to his pet. That night, in spite of his fatigue, William hardly slept. He lay awaiting the morning. After much deliberation, he decided that in the first free minute of the next working day, he would go to the woman in labor yesterday and try to find out everything. He could not go on living in ignorance and speculation. He could go crazy. He barely waited for the weekly one to end in the morning. Letichki made his rounds of his patients and immediately hurried to the floor above. William tried to calm his excitement, stepped on woozy legs into the room. The patient seemed to be asleep, but when she heard the footsteps, she opened her eyes immediately. "Good morning. How are you? My name is William. I'm a surgeon, and I helped bring your babies into the world yesterday. Congratulations on the birth of your beautiful triplets, by the way." He smiled, not knowing how to continue the conversation. Lisa was the patient's name. She spoke joyfully. "Thank you very much. I don't remember anything, of course. I was under anesthesia, but I saw the babies today. Thank you again," William said confusedly. No need to correct the whole thing. All the words prepared in advance at one look at such familiar and still favorite facial features flew out of his head. He was about to leave, but suddenly stopped and turned around and asked Lisa, "Do you happen to have a sister?" Betty's face changed. There was a look of fear or surprise in her eyes. And Betty quietly asked, "How did you know?" "I had a twin sister, but she died about 7 years ago." "An accident, or rather a traffic accident." William sat down on the chair by the bed and, seeing that she was ready to cry, tried to calm her down. "Please don't worry. You can't. Please tell me about yourself and your sister. I need it very much." Lisa, after a little silence, began to tell quietly how many years ago, when their father died, the three of them stayed in a remote little village, in an old house, inherited from their grandmother. Mother was sick all the time. There was no work. A small farm saved them. They had 1 cow, a couple of pigs, and a dozen chickens. After graduating from high school, my sister Lisa Betty couldn't stand such poverty, as she said, and went to the city to earn a living. We had a big fight before he left. I felt bad for my mother. My sister seemed to think only of herself and not of her. It was later, after her death, that I realized that she wanted to help all of us in some way, and she sent a little money on an irregular basis. But we never spoke to each other, and I was very sorry for that afterwards. She was silent for a while and turned her back to the wall. Then she continued, I knew that my sister had gotten a job in the city as a salesman and had even found a fiancé. But I didn't care about that. Mom was getting worse. Oncology rarely lets anyone survive, but I really hoped to help her. I had to sell all the animals. There was no time to look after her anyway, and I needed money for my mom's medicine. But life had a different way of dealing with our family. It turned out that Mom also survived Betty. Tears slowly flowed down Lisa's cheeks. Betty, as if wanting to talk, kept talking and talking. The news of Betty's death was like a knife to the heart, and Mom began to fade before my eyes. 6 months later, I buried her. God, I didn't think I was going to survive what was happening. I was very lost. I was alone in the world, and I didn't know how to go on. Betty was silent again, and William was afraid to look her in the eye. After all, the town fiancé and traitor he traded away. He was the one who had traded his love for his career. But he couldn't admit it. Lisa talked long and hard that day, as if she had been waiting for this moment. William knew that after the death of his sister's mother, Lisa had been left all alone in an old dilapidated house in a village where life was almost non-existent. And once big and beautiful with its school, store farm, it had become derelict. With literally 10 dwellings and a few times a week came auto shops. It was good that twice a day a bus from the district center ran through their village. That's where Lisa found a job. She would get up at 4 o'clock to be on the bus in half an hour. And at 6 o'clock p.m., she was in a hurry to get back. There was no great money in the market where she got a job, although there was enough to live on. But it seems that the death of loved ones was not all that fate had prepared Lisa as a test. One day, returning from work at the place of her house, she saw only logs and a sad pipe. Most likely an unburned coal had fallen out of the furnace damper, which was not tightly closed, and that was enough for the old house that remained. So along with it, Lisa's past life burned, and she was forced to leave the village for the city, almost immediately rented a small room on the outskirts. It was all her savings were enough for. The room was in a communal apartment with 2 other roommates. One turned out to be a small but still quite spry grandmother who was also called Lisa. She was immediately happy when she found out who the new lodger would be. That's how happy I am to have 2 Lisas for my old age. Now we can spend our evenings drinking tea. I couldn't talk to my old neighbor. She was drinking or sleeping. She fell asleep like that. And in the other rooms, the apartment is in and out. Christopher is always away on business. And John only comes here when he's with his neighbor, when he fights and she kicks him out. But for a day, and make up again. So literally in 5 minutes after crossing the threshold of the communal room, Lisa learned at once about all the tenants. She was a little uncomfortable. The first time, knowing that in her room fans found not that her dead frightened her. After her mom died, she was already cool about it. It was just that the room seemed kind of cold. But on the first day, having arranged a general cleaning atoms all and throwing away the excess, she was already by evening was satisfied with the work done. The room shone, and Lisa also dug out an old, but clean curtains and tablecloth. When at tea she learned about the burned-down house in the evening, she brought a few more sets of colored, but still quite good bedding and a couple of payers. But you'll have enough for the first time, and then we'll think of something else. At that moment, Lisa was ready to cry. Her grandmother seemed so dear to her. It wasn't because of the housewares she brought. It was the special care for strangers. They began to take care of each other like close people. Lisa almost immediately got a job at the nearest grocery store as a clerk, and always tried to take care of the good-natured neighbor, buying the necessary products for 2. Having lost her grandmother at a very early age and having no one close to her, Lisa immediately felt a kinship for her, and Lisa Ivanovna immediately became attached to her. God had not given her neighbor any grandchildren of her own. Her only son was an officer and served somewhere far away in the north. He came very rarely, but he helped his mother regularly. Lisa often remembered her son and her daughter-in-law with a kind of sadness in her voice. She didn't particularly like to talk about it, but one evening she did. Well, that's Kevin. Trusty as a chick in his 30s, never got married. And in the new unit, Evelyn was a nurse, and she had a fling. Before that, he came every vacation. How did the king come to be? He started sending money, but he only came once. And he said his wife wasn't allowed to go on vacation. No, I'm not offended. It's a young case, though it's not good for childbirth either. But I don't know what the reason was. We never had grandchildren. After that evening, seeing how hard it was for Lisa to talk about it, the girl tried to avoid the subject. That's how they lived, taking care of each other. Lisa, not listening to the neighbors' refusals, cooked her porridge in the morning and said I get up early anyway. And you should not work all day on an empty stomach. Young people need strength. Come on, eat up. I'm eating porridge with you too. Since I'm the only one who can boil it for myself. But one morning, Lisa didn't find her grandmother at the stove, and the room was suspiciously quiet. The girl felt a chill inside and knocked on the neighbor's door. Lisa called quietly, "Are you asleep?" There was silence in the room, which made Lisa's heart pound with terrible force. She was scared out of her mind. But when she opened the door, she saw her neighbor on the bed and rushed to her. It was too late. Just touching her hand, she immediately yanked hers away. It was clear that it was impossible to help. The ambulance doctor who came on the call declared death. He only said in a detached way, leaving happily in a dream she died. She did not suffer herself and did not torment others. She just fell asleep, and that's all. It was as if he envied the dead woman, though at that moment Lisa herself was envious of her. Betty showed all night, for now she was alone again. At that moment she wanted to be in her neighbor's place. At least she had a son, but Lisa was empty again. Not a soulmate in the whole world. But life went on, and she also got up in the morning. Only now there was no one to cook porridge, and she went to work. She came back again, not to dinner with tea and conversations about the past day, as it was with Lisa. It was back to her lonely world in a small room on the outskirts of town. Everything changed dramatically one day. One day, a customer literally walked from the entrance to the counter where Lisa stood. With a mysterious smile, he said, "You won't believe it. I saw you in my dream last night. I asked you your name, and you're so mysterious. Say your name is Camille." Lisa, as if under hypnosis, she said, "I'm not Camille, I'm Lisa." Apparently, at that moment, realizing that she had fallen for a clever trick, she blushed. The stranger smiled happily. He continued enthusiastically, "Well, now I know the name of such a beauty. And I'm Charles." He extended his hand for a handshake. But when Lisa timidly extended hers in return, he turned her palms down sharply and kissed her, like no one had ever kissed her hand before. Everything Charles said next didn't make any sense anymore. Lisa was in love from the first moment. No one had ever said anything like that to her before. In the evening, he was waiting outside the store with a bouquet. They wandered around the evening city black-eyed for a long time. Cheerful from the first day, from the first minute, conquered the heart of a simple village girl. She waited for the evening every day because she was sure Charles was already at the door of the store. They began to date, and after a week he moved in with her and they began to live together. Everything seemed to be going great. Charles was gentle and affectionate and tried to help around the house. There was one problem. He didn't go to work like everyone else at every mention of the subject. At such moments he would kiss Lisa and say, "Well, don't I bring money into the house, or don't we have enough? Beloved, I do everything to make sure that you don't need anything." But Lisa felt that Charles was hiding something. There was anxiety in her soul. Misha was always hiding something from her and could leave in the middle of the night, saying, "Dear, I have to go on business. I'll tell you in the morning." The girl, not understanding anything, waited for him all night. And in the morning, he said that he had a job and wanted to rest. At such times, it was impossible to get a word out of him. After the job, he sometimes came back happy and gave Lisa gifts and money. But lately, he came more often angry as a dog, and for several days went blacker than a cloud. Once, when he came back, he almost tearfully fell on his knees in front of her and, kissing her, began to talk in a rambling way. "Lisa dear, save me, help me. If not you, then no one else, I just kill." It turned out that her lover was an avid gambler. That's what he went out in the evenings for, and that's where the money was sometimes brought to the house. But it turned out the losses were much bigger, and he owed a huge amount of money. When did he say how much he owed? Lisa realized that she could not earn that much even in a year in her store. But she loved Charles very much and would do anything for him. I've never had that kind of money in my life. If my parents' house had been intact, I could have made a little money by selling it. But as it is, I have nothing and nowhere to get it. Tears ran down the girl's cheeks from resentment and helplessness. But Charles also said that he had already found out and thought of everything. He began to tell Lisa quickly how many women give birth to children for others, thus helping unhappy couples doomed to childlessness. At this, she was very much amazed at how he could calmly suggest such things to her. She had no idea that one could give birth to a child not from the person he loved, and even sell the child for money. But he knew how to push her. Of course, you're not the one who'd be killed for debt. It's not a big deal. IVF to become a surrogate mother to someone else's baby. You're going to spend the whole pregnancy eating and drinking at someone else's expense, and you're going to get paid a lot of money up front. I found out. It will be enough to pay off the debt, and there will even be some left over. Lisa hesitated for a while, but Charles managed to convince the village idiot. He even took all the organizational matters into his own hands. Very quickly, he found a decent couple, Cindy and Noah, who were just over 40. And having met Lisa, they immediately became friends with her. As soon as the girl was able to get pregnant with the help of IVF, they, however, surrounded her with care, bought all the best. They rented a beautiful big 2-bedroom in the city center, persuaded her to quit her job and get, as they said, only positive emotions. She didn't even think it was possible to live like that. The girl slept, walked, knitted, which she had not done for a long time. Cindy and Noah rejoiced like children when they found out about the pregnancy and almost immediately paid Lisa most of the agreed amount. The girl thought that Charles had done his best and had somehow managed to fool them. The couple uncomplainingly paid almost the entire sum at once, although they had originally agreed on partial payments. At this point, William noticed that either from excitement or from the long conversation, the narrator looked tired, and he asked him if you looked unwell. Maybe you should rest, and we'll continue a little later. I will come to see you and the kids more than once. But the patient, as if afraid that he would really leave, waved her head negatively, and then smiled sadly and replied, No. On the contrary, I feel better. I hadn't spoken so frankly to anyone in a long time, probably not since Lisa died. She took a sip of water from the bottle on the nightstand beside the bed and continued. Charles turned out to be a scoundrel and disappeared the same day. As soon as Noah had brought the money, saying he would take the debt and come right back, he disappeared not only by closing himself behind the apartment door, but Lisa's life as well. But that wasn't all the challenges that awaited me on life's journey. At the first ultrasound, I learned that carried for future parents not one, but 3 babies at once. Cindy and Noah were happy to learn such news even more. The girls smiled as if remembering how it was. The couple had completely changed Lisa's closet. After all, she, except for one coat and a jacket, had nothing for winter and did not have anything. They also bought a fur coat, a bunch of dresses, and other outfits. Cindy enjoyed watching Lisa try on the outfits. She said, "You should have only the best. After all, you will give us such happiness." We never thought or guessed that we would become 3 times parents at once. At that moment, Lisa interrupted the story, and her eyes filled with tears. William could hardly contain himself from rushing to her and hugging her. He was ready at that moment to give anything so that this small, so fragile woman would never cry again. The doctor no longer thought that this was not his former lover, but a completely different person. He suddenly realized that he was madly in love with this one lying in the hospital bed, a fragile and defenseless woman. At that moment, Lisa continued, "It was nothing. I tried to forget Charles and move on with my life. But the thing is, 3 months ago, Cindy and Noah disappeared. They stopped coming and stopped contacting me. I panicked. Okay, there's still one left. What about now? 3 kids. It's a good thing they paid the rent up front. And I had some money put away. Okay, if they changed their mind about taking responsibility for the massacre, it's not a big deal. It just hurts me why all these unfortunate things are happening to me. William Uva. Having listened to almost all of Lisa's life, he had already decided for himself that he would definitely never leave her and would help her in everything. The next day, when he entered the room, he saw the patient at the window. The doctor's heart was filled with pity. He quickly walked over and hugged her. Surprisingly, Lisa snuggled into his chest and cried even harder. "Hush, hush. What are you saying?" Trying to calm her down. "What's wrong to be so upset about? Everything will be all right." But Lisa, sharply pulling away and holding back the crying, said it won't be. "One of the babies has a heart defect and needs a lot of money for a repair operation. But why? Why is this happening to me again?" When Lisa calmed down a bit, William went to the resident's office. There he learned everything about the baby's condition from Robert, the one who delivered the baby. Returning to the room after the conversation, the man promised that he would definitely find a way out, and they would save the boy. In a couple of days, the young mother was to be discharged. Only 2 babies were prepared. The third had to be under the supervision of doctors until the operation. All the days after meeting Lisa, William could not think of anything else but them. He couldn't imagine what would happen if he didn't see Betty for one day, so he made a decision to be there for her. On the day he was discharged, he came to the room first thing in the morning and had the courage to say, "Lisa, I realize we don't know each other very well, but I really want to help. Please, I want you and the kids to move in with me from here. I have a beautiful apartment. No tenants, just me." So he smiled sadly and added, "It would be easier for the 2 of us to deal with the kids and any problems. And I'm a doctor, after all. What can be useful more than once?" Having agreed, he took her hand and looked into her eyes pleadingly. In these moments, he was most afraid that she would refuse. Lisa was silent for a moment, then quietly asked, "It must be inconvenient. Why would you want to be such a burden?" William was so relieved that it wasn't a refusal that it was even tighter. Squeezing his hand, the girl replied quietly, "What kind of a burden are you happiness? Maybe this is what I've been waiting for all my life. And the rest why? And why I will certainly answer. Only at home is good." She smiled and nodded. In that moment, William was the happiest man alive. After all, it meant she would be there for him. Every morning, every evening, every day. It was the same day he had happily opened the doors of his apartment to the woman who had become his family in such a short time. "Well, this is your home now," William said quietly as he let her in. "Sorry, there's no nursery yet, but I'll be sure to remodel one of the baby rooms." But Lisa looked at him with such gratitude that he realized she would stay even if there was only one room in the apartment. In the evening, after putting the babies to bed, they sat in the kitchen for a long time, and already William was telling it like it was. He began with how he had met her sister, how they had loved each other. Then he sadly told how his parents had not accepted Betty, wishing him a more wealthy and educated bride. "And of course, I repented of my betrayal. I can't forgive myself for choosing medicine over my heart and my parents over my favorite career. If I had married Betty, she might still be alive." Agreed, it was he tried to avert his eyes so Lisa wouldn't see the tears on the return. Throughout, she listened silently, not uttering a word. William at one point was even afraid that Lisa would accuse him of all the grave sins and refuse to stay with him under the same roof. But she, listening intently, put her hand on William's arm, nervously twirling a teaspoon in the show all evening. "Betty, you won't get it back, but I think, as a twin sister, I have the right to give you forgiveness for her." Smiling sadly, she stroked William's hand so tenderly that he felt at once at ease. It was as if Betty had really forgiven him. In surgery, when they heard about the new family, the doctors started to twist their heads and murmur behind their backs. They say the man's gone crazy with loneliness. So many unmarried beauties sighing for him, and he chose a redneck with 3 children. But William didn't care about all the gossip. He had already realized that he had fallen in love and was ready to do anything for Lisa and the children. His first priority now was to help the sick baby. But how did he not know? Money was needed. There was nowhere to get it. At some point, it literally hit him. Coming back after work, he said to Lisa right from the doorstep, I know who can help us with money for the operation. I have a patient I once saved. He's a great detective. I told you about him. He's the one who figured out the coin and its demise for me." Seeing a perplexed look, without giving her, "I remember," continued, "I'll ask you to find your missing businessman. Even if they changed their minds about taking the kids, I think we'll not refuse to help in the rescue of one of them." The detective was glad to meet the savior again, and when he learned that his search could save someone's life, he quickly found all the necessary information, only it didn't bring joy to anyone. The thing was, the couple wasn't just missing. 3 months ago, the irreparable happened. There was a terrible ice storm that day, and Noah, out of control, swerved into the oncoming lane. The driver of the truck they hit didn't even have time to slow down. The car of the businessman and his wife was literally smeared on the road. There was no chance of rescue. After listening to Stephen, William was at a loss. He was already thinking of how to tell Lisa, but the detective continued, "Doctor, it's not that bad. There's a chance. It's just like mine once was. The thing is, Noah's parents are elderly, and they're the ones who inherited his dead son's entire fortune." He held out a little leaf with an address on it. "It's not far away in a cottage community. You want me to drive you? There's no time to lose. We have to save the baby and take every chance we can." They immediately went to the address on the piece of paper. Instead of expecting to see a huge mansion with security cameras, waiting for them was a very neat 2-story house with a good wooden fence, and the most ordinary without codes and security gates. When they rang the bell that sat on a mount with a visor, apparently from bad weather, they saw the light on the porch. But who was not at home in the evening? They heard a disgruntled man's voice. The time was indeed already evening, and the sun had not yet reached the village. The village was already beginning to hide behind the horizon. William was confused at first, but when the gate opened, he immediately said good evening with confidence. "Excuse me, for God's sake. We really need to talk about your grandson, or rather, one of your grandsons." Even in the evening darkness, it was visible how the old man who met them changed in his face. He said in an agitated but stern voice, "Who are you?" "Swindlers, extortionists." "Then you're in the wrong place. Let's get out of here. Our son couldn't have children, and he certainly didn't send us any from the other side of the world." He was about to leave, but William spoke quickly and began to tell about the surrogate mother, about IVF, and how she was left without protection and resources with 3 babies in her arms, one of whom needed an operation. The owner listened silently and also sternly said, "Go inside, but I will tell my wife everything first. Sit in the kitchen, and then God forbid that your heart could withstand such news. We'll decide what to do next." Stephen and William sat in silence. There was one reassurance. God forbid anything should happen. Help would come at once, but the old men were of a different temperament. Very quickly, literally in about 10 minutes, Noah's parents came out and sat down at the table opposite the guests. The woman, the first one, started the conversation, trying to keep her cool. "No one told us about the idea of having babies by another person. I guess Noah was hoping for a surprise, as always. But life had taken a different course." Her husband interrupted her, and he said, more calmly than when we met, "So we boys, of course, will help with the operation and treatment, but we still have to make sure that these are our children." Cindy, with Noah here, Stephen also joined the conversation. "Of course, tomorrow we will bring all the documents, receipts, and tests that the mother has. And you can conduct a DNA examination at any time." The money for the operation was already in the boy's account the same night, thanks to which by the evening of the next day he was moved from the operating room to the intensive care unit. Lisa and William took turns visiting the baby, and even once brought the newly minted grandparents to see their grandson saved. To the surprise of everyone, the grandfather, so strong and bossy-looking, was the first to tear up, and his spouse only carefully wiped his tears away. After the hospital, William offered to go to his house and meet the rest of his grandchildren. I was a little hesitant. The parents agreed after all. Within an hour, they were already holding their grandson and granddaughter in their arms and happy, crying. As she left that day, Noah's mom came up to Lisa and hugged her and said, "Thank you. my good sweetheart. You brought us back from the orphanage to life. We're too old to take on the responsibility of raising a grandchild. But I beg you, don't deprive us of contact with them. We'll help you in return. We thought we were all alone in the world. Noah was the only one we had. Lisa thanked for helping the baby and promised to bring the children to visit as often as possible. And so she did. She and William began to visit the old people regularly and bring their grandchildren. When they got a little older, William would often bring the rowdy trio all weekend at their mother's request. They would, as the happy grandfather would say, bring the whole house down and kiss the grandparents goodbye and leave. When the kids were a year old, William proposed to Lisa, and she, starring like a schoolgirl, replied, "Of course I do. Where will we go without you now?" She pressed herself against his chest so tightly that William almost choked. It was not so much from the strength of her embrace as from his love for her. They decided to get married quietly, without noise and friends in a small circle, and after the wedding just go to the cottage village. All the more for the time of registration. The noisy trio had to stay there at the same grandparents. The day before the wedding, Lisa hugged her beloved and asked, "What about your parents? Are they alive? Why did you ever talk about them?" William told her that it was extremely rare that he called them to see if everyone said hello well, but communication was strained. He couldn't forgive them for the separation and then their deaths. After listening to him, fragile but very wise, Lisa said to her beloved, "You must forgive them and invite them to join us. After all, they do not even realize that they will now be grandparents like Noah's parents." William thought about what Lisa had said, and in his heart he agreed with her. But it was not easy to take such a step after so many years of strained relationships. In life, it turned out to be the most important thing to make the first step. His parents, having just learned about the upcoming wedding, and 3 grandchildren, already the next day stood on the doorstep. From the first minutes, they found a common language with everyone. And William was surprised at how much the loneliness had changed them. After a couple of hours, the grandparents were said to be having conversations. The grandmothers, on the other hand, were running after their grandchildren like faces, outstripping each other every minute, wiping away tears with sniffles and huffing and puffing. William and Lisa calmly went to the registration, where Stephen the detective and his girlfriend were witnesses. When they returned to the streets, under the awning, a table was set with goodies prepared by the grandmothers, and by the fire over the fragrant meat feasts were given and the newly minted grandfathers. The children fell asleep in the evening just by touching the pillow, and adults still sat outside for a long time, and from the outside it seemed that these people were very close and dear to each other. When the evening was drawing to a close, Noah's father stood up and said in a confident voice, "Well, we are grateful to fate that our children had time to do such an important and necessary thing for us old people. William, Lisa, thank you so much for being in our lives. You are like our own children to us now, but grandchildren are already our own." A sip of juice from the glass on the table. He continued, "My wife and I have discussed everything and decided that we need to think about the future of this trio of Irishmen and left them a will for everything we have and what is left from the children. So we think they'll have enough to live on. The main thing is that you raise them to be smart and right people. What are you like?" When the father finished, William got up and, looking at all those present at the table enigmatically, said, "Well, since we have such a solemn day and an evening of revelations, Lisa and I also want to say that, having thought about it, we decided that where there are 3 children, there will be 4 children as well." "Yes, my love." Lisa smiled happily and kissed her husband and answered, "Yes, my love. All the more we will have a girl. So the score of our family will be 2-2. After this news, the grandparents had tears of joy in their eyes, and for some reason they began to congratulate each other.